It started with the bite marks on Chitty's neck. Tiny, red punctures that appeared one morning as Amaka lifted him from his crib. She'd blinked, rubbed her eyes, and checked again, wondering if she was just seeing things. But no, the marks were real, and though they were small, they stood out against his soft, baby skin. Confused and a little worried, she thought it must have been a bug bite. She called out to Yuzo, who frowned but shrugged it off too. Maybe it was just a mosquito or something, he said. They agreed to keep an eye on it. But the next morning there were scratches. Thin red lines on Chitty's arms and tiny little bruises near his knees. Amaka's heart sank. She looked at her baby, only 3 months old, barely able to move on his own. Yet suddenly, he seemed marked by something she couldn't explain. Yuzo checked the crib and found nothing unusual. They tried to brush it off again, even as Amaka felt a gnawing worry in her chest. Then Chitty started vomiting in his sleep. The first time, Amaka woke to find his sheets damp and his face a little pale. She rushed to clean him, her hands shaking as she tried to wake him up. Yuzo took him to the doctor that morning, but the doctor assured them Chitty was fine. It's normal for babies to spit up, he said, smiling gently, as though they were just overly worried new parents. His weight is fine. Nothing seems wrong, but things kept getting worse. Amaka and Yuzo spent more and more nights awake, watching over Chitty, hoping to catch what was happening. Yet, every morning, it was the same. New scratches, new bruises, and that unsettled feeling that something was wrong. They couldn't help but think back to when things had seemed simpler, just a few months ago, when they had first brought Chitty home. Back then, the challenges of parenthood had felt exhausting, but in a familiar way. The late nights, the feedings, the quiet moments spent soothing a crying baby. Now, the exhaustion was mixed with a deeper worry, a fear that something was slipping out of their control. 3 months earlier, Amaka had let out a deep sigh as she cradled Chitty, bouncing him gently to soothe his cries. It was already past midnight, and she hadn't managed more than a few hours of sleep since bringing him home from the hospital. She looked at Yuzo, who was seated on the bed, rubbing his temples, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. They had barely adjusted to life as new parents, and already, it felt like they were sinking under the weight of it all. Maybe he's hungry again, Amaka murmured, though she just fed him less than an hour ago. Chitty's cries were sharp and piercing, filling the small bedroom with a sound that seemed louder in the stillness of the night. Yuzo nodded wearily. "Let me try holding him," he offered, reaching his arms out for Chitty. Amaka handed him over, her arms aching from holding him for hours on end. She watched as Yuzo rocked Chitty gently, patting his back in slow, comforting strokes. But Chitty's cries didn't ease. "It's like nothing we do works," Amaka said, her voice barely a whisper. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. Her whole body ached from exhaustion, and she longed for sleep. She was grateful for Chitty, of course, but she couldn't deny the frustration that had been slowly building up. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," Yuzo admitted, still trying to soothe the baby. His eyes were heavy, the dark circles beneath them evidence of the many sleepless nights they'd had. "We're both working, Amaka. We can't keep going on like this." Amaka nodded, leaning back against the wall. She knew he was right. Both of them worked demanding jobs in the city, Yuzo as a mechanic, often putting in long hours, and she as a sales clerk in a busy supermarket. Balancing work and caring for Chitty felt like trying to carry the world on their shoulders. Yet, the thought of bringing in help was something they hadn't really considered until now. "Maybe we could get someone to help during the day," Amaka suggested hesitantly. "Just someone who can keep an eye on him while we're at work. Maybe a nanny?" Yuzo glanced at her, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "A nanny? You really think we need one?" She sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. "I don't think we have a choice. We're barely getting any sleep, and we need to be alert at work. We could ask one of our relatives back in the village. Someone we know and trust." Yuzo thought about it, nodding slowly. "You're right. If we're going to bring someone into our home, it should be family. We can't just hire anyone from the city. We need someone who'll treat Chitty like their own." The next day, they sat down and thought about their options, going over which relatives might be willing to send someone to help. After some discussion, Yuzo remembered a distant cousin who had a young daughter, Ngozi, who was known for being responsible and reliable. Ngozi's family lived in the village, and though they weren't very close, Yuzo trusted his cousin's family. It could work, he said thoughtfully. Ngozi is old enough to help out, and her family is decent. They're not the type to cause trouble. Amaka nodded, relieved to have a solution in sight. Should we call and ask? They made the call that evening, reaching out to Yuzo's cousin and explaining the situation. Yuzo's cousin, a kind woman named Auntie Neka, seemed more than willing to let Ngozi come to the city. Ngozi is a good girl, she assured them. She's always been responsible, and I think she'll do well taking care of Chitty. It will also be a good opportunity for her to see the city and learn a bit about city life. With that, the arrangements were quickly made. A week later, Ngozi arrived, a quiet, polite teenager with large, observant eyes. She carried a single worn-out bag, her clothes carefully folded inside, and greeted Yuzo and Amaka with a respectful bow. There was something about her quiet demeanor that reassured Amaka right away. She seemed obedient and kind, a gentle presence that seemed perfect for taking care of a baby. As days passed, Amaka and Yuzo began to feel the relief of having Ngozi's help. She handled Chitty with surprising ease, keeping him calm when he fussed and watching him during the day while they went to work. She cooked meals, cleaned the house, and even managed to lull Chitty to sleep on nights when Amaka felt too tired to move. For the first time since Chitty's birth, Amaka felt she could finally breathe. "Thank you, Ngozi," Amaka said one evening, watching as Ngozi rocked Chitty in her arms. The baby cooed softly, reaching his tiny hand up to touch Ngozi's cheek. The young girl smiled, her eyes gentle as she looked down at him. "It's my pleasure, Auntie," she replied, her voice soft and even. "I'm happy to be here and help you both." Life seemed to settle into a new rhythm. With Ngozi's help, Yuzo and Amaka could focus on their work during the day and even catch up on sleep. Amaka felt lighter, no longer carrying the constant weight of exhaustion. She'd grown fond of Ngozi, treating her almost like a younger sister. Yuzo, too, appreciated her help, feeling a renewed sense of peace in their home. But even as life grew easier, Amaka sometimes felt an odd sense of unease. It wasn't something she could put into words, just a strange, fleeting feeling that would come over her late at night as she checked on Chitty. Occasionally, she'd catch Ngozi's shadow moving in the hallway, quick and silent, her figure almost gliding past in the dim light. Amaka would brush it off as tiredness or simply her mind playing tricks. Then there was the incident of the small doll. One afternoon, Amaka noticed a small, handmade doll tucked into Chitty's crib. It was crudely sewn from scraps of cloth, with little beads for eyes and strange red thread wrapped around its arms and legs. Startled, she picked it up, wondering where it had come from. She didn't remember buying it, and it certainly hadn't come with the other toys. "Ngozi, did you put this in Chitty's crib?" she asked, holding up the doll when Ngozi came into the room. Ngozi's face remained calm, though her eyes flickered with a hint of something unreadable. "Yes, Auntie. It's a small doll I made. It's meant to protect Chitty and keep him safe." Amaka felt a slight shiver run down her spine. She wasn't sure why, but something about the doll made her uncomfortable. Still, she forced a smile and placed the doll back in the crib, not wanting to hurt Ngozi's feelings. "Thank you," she said quietly, though she decided to remove it later when Ngozi wasn't around. With each passing day, Amaka grew more and more grateful for Ngozi's presence. But the strange feeling she couldn't shake continued to linger. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that she was just imagining things, that everything was perfectly fine. But that was before the bite marks appeared. That was before the scratches, the strange bruises, and the endless trips to the doctor. The day they first noticed the bite marks, Amaka felt her heart drop. She was getting Chitty dressed when she saw 2 small punctures on his neck, faint but unmistakable. She froze, her fingers trembling as she touched them, wondering what could have caused them. "Yuzo," she called out, her voice tight with fear. Yuzo rushed in, looking at her with concern. "What is it?" he asked, his eyes widening as he saw the marks on Chitty's neck. He frowned, examining them closely. Could it be a mosquito bite? I don't know, Amaka replied, her voice barely a whisper. But it looks strange. Yuzo shrugged it off, though he looked slightly unsettled. Let's keep an eye on it. Maybe it's just from him scratching himself. But deep down, Amaka wasn't convinced. And as the days passed, Chitty's condition seemed to worsen. The bite marks didn't heal, and each morning seemed to bring new bruises, scratches, or strange marks on his tiny body. It wasn't long before Yuzo and Amaka found themselves facing sleepless nights again. Not from Chitty's cries, but from a growing sense of dread they couldn't understand. They had no answers, no clear signs of what was happening, but a quiet fear began to build between them. A fear that something unseen, something dark, was threatening their little family. The strange marks and bruises on Chitty didn't go away. In fact, they seemed to get worse. Every morning, Amaka would gently lift her baby out of his crib, hoping, almost praying, not to find any new scratches or marks. But each time it was the same story. Chitty's little body seemed covered in fresh bruises and scratches. And now, strange little red marks kept appearing around his neck and arms. Amaka and Yuzo couldn't understand it. They watched him so closely during the day, and Ngozi was always so gentle with him. She treated Chitty with care, always checking on him, rocking him to sleep, and even humming softly when he seemed restless. Nothing about Ngozi's behavior made them suspect her. She was respectful and obedient, never giving them a reason to doubt her. But the strange things kept happening, and Chitty's health seemed to suffer more each day. He started vomiting more often, and he had trouble sleeping at night. Every time they tried to get him to settle, he'd cry, fuss, or just lie there staring into space with wide, fearful eyes. Amaka could tell something was deeply wrong, but she didn't know what. Finally, one morning, she sat Yuzo down in the kitchen, both of them exhausted and worried. She could see the tiredness in his eyes, the worry lines creasing his forehead. She knew he felt just as helpless as she did. Yuzo, I don't know how much longer we can keep guessing, Amaka said, rubbing her hands nervously. We need answers. This isn't normal, and no matter what we do, Chitty just keeps getting worse. Yuzo nodded, his gaze fixed on the cup of tea in front of him. I know, Amaka, but what else can we do? We've taken him to the doctor so many times, and every single time they tell us he's fine. They say it's just normal baby stuff. Amaka shook her head. It can't be, Yuzo. Those bite marks, the scratches, the vomiting. It's not just normal baby stuff. I don't know what it is, but something is wrong. I can feel it. Yuzo looked at her thoughtfully, his eyes clouded with worry. Do you think there's something wrong with the house? Like maybe some kind of pest or animal we don't know about? Amaka hesitated, considering the idea. I don't know. It would explain the bite marks, maybe. But what about everything else? The vomiting, his trouble sleeping. It just doesn't add up. They both sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The more they thought about it, the stranger the situation felt. Amaka sighed and glanced at the doorway where Ngozi had just passed by, carrying a load of laundry. She couldn't help but feel grateful for Ngozi's help, especially with how exhausted she and Yuzo were. If anything, Ngozi seemed to be the only one who could calm Chitty down at times, humming to him in a way that seemed to soothe him, if only briefly. Do you think? Could it be something spiritual? Yuzo asked softly, almost afraid to voice the thought. Amaka looked at him, her heart racing. You mean, like some kind of evil spirit or curse? Yuzo shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. I don't know. It's just that I can't shake this feeling. You felt it too, haven't you? That sense that something's not right in the house. Amaka nodded slowly. She had felt it. An uneasy, cold feeling that would creep over her at random times. But she didn't want to jump to any conclusions. After all, Ngozi had been nothing but kind to them and seemed genuinely caring toward Chitty. I don't know, Yuzo. I just don't want to start thinking the worst without any real proof, Amaka said carefully. But maybe we should explore all our options. Yuzo leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with his hands. All right, What if we went to a prayer house, just to see if they could offer any advice or help? Amaka looked at him, weighing the idea. A prayer house wasn't something they had considered before, but with how desperate they were feeling, it might be their only choice. Let's think about it, she said finally. If things don't improve soon, maybe we'll go. Days passed, but Chitty's condition only seemed to worsen. His once chubby cheeks were now pale and he'd lost weight. Amaka and Yuzo barely slept at night, taking turns watching over him, hoping to catch whatever was causing him harm. They tried everything they could think of, even setting up a small camera near his crib, but every morning they found no new clues. One night, as Amaka paced the hallway in the early hours, she heard a faint hissing sound coming from Chitty's room. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, listening carefully. The sound stopped as quickly as it started, but it left her feeling deeply unsettled. She walked into Chitty's room and checked his crib, only to find him whimpering softly, his tiny fingers clutching the blanket. "What's wrong, Chitty?" she whispered, gently touching his cheek. His skin felt unusually cold, and she shivered, feeling a strange chill in the air. She scooped him up, cradling him close, but even as she held him, she couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was watching them. By morning, she'd made up her mind. "Yuzo, we need to go to the prayer house," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't something we can handle on our own. We need help." Yuzo agreed without hesitation. He'd been feeling the same thing, that whatever was happening was beyond their understanding and needed more than just medicine or doctor visits. They both decided they would take Chitty to a local prayer house that had been recommended by one of Yuzo's friends. The pastor there was known for helping families with strange or troubling situations. They hoped he would be able to provide some insight into what was happening. The following day, they made their way to the prayer house, carrying Chitty in a blanket. The prayer house was a simple building, surrounded by open fields and clusters of trees. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet and calming, with soft singing and the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. The pastor, a gentle man with a calm presence, welcomed them and listened as they explained Chitty's strange symptoms, the bite marks, the scratches, and the endless illnesses that no doctor could explain. When they finished speaking, the pastor nodded slowly, looking thoughtful. "This is not the first time I have heard such a story," he said. "There are forces in this world that we don't always understand. Sometimes, they find a way into our lives without us even knowing." Amaka's heart pounded. "Pastor, do you think something like that is happening to our son?" The pastor looked at her and Yuzo with kind, serious eyes. "It is possible. Sometimes, spirits or curses can attach themselves to people or places, especially if there is a connection to something dark or unfinished." Yuzo glanced at Amaka, his face tense. "What should we do, Pastor? We don't know what could be causing this." The pastor thought for a moment, then said, "Do you have anyone in your household who is not family? Someone who may have brought something unusual with them?" Amaka's heart skipped a beat. "Well, we have a young girl from the village, Ngozi. She's helping us care for Chitty. She's a distant relative, but we don't know her very well." The pastor nodded, considering this. "It could be nothing, but sometimes people carry spirits or curses unknowingly, especially if there is a history or ritual involved. I would suggest you bring her here as well. Perhaps we can pray for her and see if anything comes to light." Amaka felt a pang of guilt. Ngozi had been so kind to them, and accusing her, even indirectly, felt wrong. But they were desperate, and if this was the only way to help Chitty, she couldn't ignore it. "We'll bring her," Yuzo agreed, squeezing Amaka's hand. "Thank you, Pastor. We'll come back tomorrow with Ngozi." As they left the prayer house, Amaka felt a mix of relief and dread. She was hopeful that they might finally get answers, but a small voice inside her whispered that they might not like what they found. Back at home, Amaka and Yuzo tried to act normal around Ngozi. They didn't want to alarm her or make her feel uncomfortable. Ngozi continued to help with Chitty, carrying him around the house and humming softly as she rocked him to sleep. But Amaka couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That evening, when Chitty was asleep, Amaka approached Ngozi. "Ngozi, tomorrow we're going to visit a prayer house with Chitty. We'd like you to come with us." Ngozi looked at her, her expression calm but a little puzzled. "Is something wrong, Auntie?" Amaka forced a smile. No, we just thought it might be good to pray for the family's health. Chitty hasn't been feeling well, as you know." Ngozi nodded slowly. "I understand, Auntie. I will come with you." That night, Amaka couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the pastor's words, about the idea of spirits and curses. She lay awake, watching the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. Around midnight, she heard the faintest hissing sound again, like something slithering across the floor. Her heart raced, but she told herself it was just her imagination. Then, just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard Chitty's cries. She rushed to his room, only to find Ngozi standing by his crib, her back to the door. Her posture seemed strange, her shoulders hunched and tense. "Ngozi," Amaka called out softly. Ngozi turned around slowly, her eyes wide, almost wild. There was a strange glint in them, something cold and unreadable. But within seconds, her face softened, and she smiled. "Sorry, Auntie," she said calmly. "Chitty was crying, and I thought I'd check on him." Amaka's skin prickled with unease, but she forced herself to smile back. "Thank you, Ngozi. You can go back to bed now." As Ngozi left the room, Amaka couldn't help but feel that something dark had just passed through the room. Something she couldn't explain. She picked up Chitty, cradling him close, feeling the small, rapid beats of his heart. He seemed restless, shifting and whimpering in his sleep. For the rest of the night, Amaka sat by Chitty's crib, watching over him, feeling the weight of worry settle in her chest. She knew, deep down, that tomorrow would bring answers, whether she was ready for them or not. The morning came with a strange stillness in the air. Amaka woke early, her heart heavy but determined. Today they would go to the prayer house with Ngozi and finally, she hoped, get answers. She and Yuzo had barely slept. All night, Amaka had listened for sounds coming from Chitty's room, praying she wouldn't hear the strange hissing sound again. Thankfully, the night had passed quietly. As she moved around the house, packing a small bag for Chitty, she glanced over at Yuzo, who was preparing breakfast. He looked tired, his face drawn and serious. Neither of them spoke much. They both felt tense, and they didn't want to worry each other more than they already were. Finally, Amaka went to call Ngozi from her room. She knocked on the door gently, calling her name. "Ngozi, are you ready? We'll leave soon." The door creaked open slowly, and Ngozi stepped out, dressed in her usual clothes, her face calm but a little distant. She looked at Amaka with an expression that Amaka couldn't quite read. Was it sadness? Or maybe something else? Something harder? "Yes, Auntie, I'm ready," she replied in a soft voice, her gaze lowering to the floor. "Good," Amaka replied, giving her a small smile, though it felt forced. She couldn't shake the feeling from last night. The way Ngozi had looked at her in Chitty's room, with those strange, unreadable eyes. Yuzo came over, holding Chitty in his arms, the baby bundled up in a warm blanket. Chitty looked peaceful, his tiny face relaxed, unaware of the tension that filled the room. Amaka took a deep breath, hoping that everything would go smoothly once they arrived at the prayer house. "Let's go," Yuzo said, nodding toward the door. They all moved toward the door, but suddenly, something changed in the air. It was as if a chill had swept through the room, and Amaka felt the hairs on her arms rise. She turned to look at Ngozi, who was standing very still, her eyes fixed on Chitty with an intense, almost hungry look. "Ngozi?" Amaka asked, her voice shaky, but Ngozi didn't respond. Instead, a strange, unsettling expression spread across her face, and she began to tremble. Before they could react, Ngozi's body began to shift. Her skin seemed to ripple, her features changing, and then her entire form began to stretch and twist in a horrifying way. Amaka let out a gasp, stepping back as she clutched Yuzo's arm tightly, her eyes wide with terror. "Ngozi, what are you doing?" Yuzo shouted, his voice filled with shock and disbelief. But it was too late. Before their eyes, Ngozi had transformed into a large snake, her body coiled tightly, her eyes glowing with a cold, eerie light. Her scales were dark and glistening, and she let out a low, menacing hiss that sent chills down Amaka's spine. Amaka and Yuzo were frozen in fear, unable to believe what they were seeing. The sweet, polite girl who had cared for their son had become something monstrous, something they couldn't understand. Suddenly, the snake lunged forward, striking Yuzo with incredible speed. Its fangs sank into his shoulder, and he cried out in pain, stumbling backward as he clutched his shoulder. Blood began to seep through his shirt, and he staggered, barely able to stay on his feet. "Yuzo!" Amaka screamed, rushing to his side, but the snake quickly turned its attention to her, slithering closer with frightening speed. Amaka tried to move back, but the snake lunged again, this time striking her leg. She felt a sharp, burning pain as the fangs pierced her skin, and she fell to the ground, gasping in pain. Her leg throbbed, and she could feel a strange numbness spreading through her body. Through her blurred vision, she watched in horror as the snake coiled itself around Chitty, who had begun to cry, sensing the danger around him. The snake's movements were quick and controlled, and within seconds, it had wrapped its body around Chitty, lifting him up as if he weighed nothing. "No, no, please," Amaka cried out, reaching out with a trembling hand, but her strength was fading, and her vision was growing dim. With one last, chilling hiss, the snake slithered out of the house, taking Chitty with it. Yuzo and Amaka lay on the floor, both injured and helpless, their hearts pounding with fear and despair as they realized their baby had been taken. Amaka didn't know how long she lay there on the floor, but slowly, she began to regain her senses. The pain in her leg was sharp, but the numbness had started to fade, and she forced herself to sit up, wincing as she tried to move. Beside her, Yuzo was groaning, his face pale and strained with pain. She reached over, touching his shoulder gently. "Yuzo, Yuzo, are you all right?" He nodded weakly, his hand still pressed against the wound on his shoulder. "Amaka, Chitty, she took him. She took our son," he whispered, his voice thick with fear and sorrow. Tears streamed down Amaka's face as she realized the full weight of what had happened. Their baby, their precious Chitty, had been stolen by something that was once Ngozi, something that had turned into a creature of horror right before their eyes. "We have to go after her," Amaka said, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "We can't leave him with that thing." Yuzo nodded, gritting his teeth as he forced himself to stand, despite the pain. "You're right. We have to save Chitty. We have to get him back." They managed to help each other up, supporting one another as they stumbled out of the house, their minds focused on one thing: finding their son. Though they had no idea where the snake, Ngozi, had gone, they knew they had to try. As they walked, Amaka's mind raced, filled with questions and confusion. How had this happened? How could Ngozi, a girl they had trusted, turn into a snake? What kind of darkness had she brought into their home? Desperate for help, they remembered the pastor at the prayer house. He had warned them that someone close to them might be carrying a dark spirit, and now they understood just how real his warning had been. They arrived at the prayer house, battered and barely able to stand, but determined. The pastor, seeing their injuries and the look of terror in their eyes, rushed over to help them. "Please." "You were right, Pastor," Yuzo gasped, his voice strained with pain. "Ngozi, she's not human. She turned into a snake and took our baby. We need your help." The pastor's face grew solemn, and he immediately gathered a few members of the prayer house to assist them. He listened carefully as Amaka and Yuzo explained what had happened, his expression grave as he realized the severity of their situation. "We must act quickly," the pastor said firmly. "This is not just a dark spirit. This is a powerful curse, one that has bound Ngozi to something evil. If she has taken your son, it means she intends to use him for a ritual." Amaka's heart pounded as she heard those words. "A ritual? What kind of ritual?" The pastor looked at her with sad, serious eyes. "A ritual to complete her transformation. The spirit that possesses her demands life, especially the life of the innocent. If we don't stop her in time, she will use your son to fulfill her curse, Yuzo gripped Amaka's hand tightly, his face pale but filled with fierce determination. Then we'll do whatever it takes to stop her. Just tell us what to do. The pastor nodded, gathering a few sacred items. Blessed oil, a prayer book, and a small cross. We will need to follow her to the place where the ritual must be completed. I believe she would go to an old shrine deep in the forest, a place where dark rituals are known to be performed. Amaka shivered, fear gripping her heart as she imagined Chitty alone in a place filled with such darkness. But she knew they couldn't give up. She and Yuzo would face whatever they had to in order to bring their son home. The pastor led them and a few prayer warriors into the forest, moving quickly but carefully, as they followed faint traces of snake tracks on the ground. The forest was thick and dark, with twisted trees and shadows that seemed to stretch and move. Amaka kept close to Yuzo, her heart racing with every step. They walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and more silent the deeper they went. Finally, they saw it. A clearing where an old, crumbling shrine stood, hidden among the trees. The place had an eerie, unsettling feel, and Amaka felt a chill run down her spine. As they approached, they saw Ngozi, or what used to be her, standing near the shrine, her form shifting between human and snake. She held Chitty in her arms, her eyes fixed on the altar with a look of fierce determination. "Stop!" the pastor called out, his voice strong and filled with authority. "Ngozi, release that child. You do not have to complete this ritual." Ngozi turned to look at them, her eyes cold and distant, her face twisted with anger, and she hissed, her voice a strange mix of human and snake. "This is my destiny," she said, her voice filled with bitterness. "I was chosen for this. My father prepared me for this path. Cannot turn back now." Amaka stepped forward, her voice trembling but filled with desperation. "Ngozi, please, he's just a baby. Don't do this. Whatever you're going through, we can help you. Just let him go." For a moment, Ngozi seemed to hesitate, her expression softening. But then her face hardened again, and she clutched Chitty tightly, her body beginning to shift fully into her snake form. "No one can help me," she hissed, her voice filled with pain. "This is the path I was given, and I must complete it." The pastor held up the blessed oil, stepping forward with the prayer warriors. "Ngozi, in the name of all that is holy, release this child and turn away from the darkness. There is still a chance for you to break free." The prayer warriors began chanting, their voices filling the air with a powerful, rhythmic prayer. Ngozi let out a scream, her body writhing as if in pain, her snake form flickering and weakening. But she fought back, her eyes blazing with defiance. She slithered closer to the altar, holding Chitty tightly, her determination clear. The chanting grew louder, and she cried out, struggling against the power of the prayers. Amaka and Yuzo watched, their hearts pounding as they prayed silently, hoping against hope that Ngozi would find the strength to release Chitty. As the prayers continued, Ngozi began to tremble, her snake form shifting back into her human self. Tears streamed down her face, and she looked at Amaka and Yuzo, her expression filled with sorrow. I didn't want this," she whispered, her voice broken. But my father, he forced me into this life. I didn't have a choice." Amaka's heart ached as she saw the pain in Ngozi's eyes. She took a step forward, her voice gentle. "Ngozi, you don't have to do this. You can choose a different path." With one final, agonized cry, Ngozi released Chitty, letting him fall into Amaka's arms. She collapsed to the ground, her body shaking as the spirit left her, her form finally returning to a normal, human shape. Amaka clutched Chitty tightly, relief flooding over her as she held her son, safe at last. The pastor approached Ngozi, his voice soft but firm. "You are free now, Ngozi. You can begin again." Ngozi looked up, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Thank you." Amaka held Chitty tightly, rocking him back and forth, her heart pounding with relief. She still couldn't believe what had just happened. That Ngozi, who they had trusted with their son, had turned into a snake and tried to use him in some dark ritual. But here was Chitty, warm and alive in her arms, and that was all that mattered. Yuzo stood close, watching Ngozi, who was now kneeling on the ground, her face hidden in her hands. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs, her thin frame looking even more fragile now than before. The pastor and his prayer warriors stood nearby, silently watching, their expressions serious but calm. After a moment, Ngozi lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, her eyes full of pain and shame. She looked up at Amaka and Yuzo, her gaze filled with a deep sadness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted this. Never wanted to hurt anyone." Amaka looked at her, struggling to find the right words. There was so much anger, fear, and confusion swirling inside her, but she couldn't deny the sadness she saw in Ngozi's eyes. "Why Ngozi?" Yuzo finally asked, his voice rough with emotion. "How could you do this to us?" To Chidi, Ngozi took a shaky breath, wiping her face with the back of her hand. It wasn't always like this," she began, her voice trembling. I wasn't always like this." The pastor nodded, encouraging her. "Tell us, Ngozi. It's time to tell the truth." Ngozi hesitated, glancing at the ground as if she was gathering the strength to speak. Finally, she began. "It all started when I was a little girl," Ngozi said quietly, her eyes distant as if she was remembering another time, another life. "My father, he was different. People in the village respected him, but they also feared him. They said he had powers, that he was connected to the spirits. But I was just a child. I didn't understand what any of it meant." She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "He would take me into the forest sometimes, late at night. I remember him telling me stories about snakes, about how they were not just animals but beings with ancient power. He said they were protectors, guardians, and that I was special, that I had been chosen to understand their secrets." Yuzo frowned, crossing his arms. "Your father made you believe that snakes were guardians?" Ngozi nodded, a bitter smile on her lips. "Yes. At first, it sounded beautiful, like some kind of ancient magic. He would tell me that the snake spirit could give me power, protect me from harm, make me strong." Her smile faded, replaced by a look of deep sorrow. "But I didn't know what he really meant. I didn't know what he was preparing me for." Amaka clutched Chidi tighter, her heart aching as she listened. She could almost imagine little Ngozi, innocent and trusting, listening to her father's strange stories. "One night, when I was about 10, Ngozi continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "He took me deep into the forest. I remember feeling scared, but he kept telling me not to be afraid, that I was safe with him. He made a fire, and he began chanting in a language I didn't understand. He was calling something, calling the snake spirit." Her face twisted with pain, and she shuddered as if the memory itself brought her fear. "What happened, Ngozi?" the pastor asked gently. Ngozi took a deep breath, her hands trembling. A snake appeared. It was massive, with scales that shone in the firelight. My father knelt in front of it, like he was in awe, like he was worshipping it. Then he told me to kneel too, to show respect to the guardian spirit. I was so scared, but I did what he said. Yuzo and Amaka exchanged a horrified glance, both of them unable to imagine what that must have felt like for a child. "He told me to hold out my hand," Ngozi said, her voice choked. I was shaking, but he said it was important that I had to trust him. So I held out my hand, and the snake slithered closer. Its eyes were so cold, so empty. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she struggled to continue. "The snake bit me right here," she said, showing them a small scar on her wrist. "It hurt so much, I thought I was going to die. But my father just watched, and he told me to be brave, that this was the first step to becoming one with the snake spirit." Amaka covered her mouth, horrified. "Your own father let a snake bite you?" Ngozi nodded, wiping away a tear. "Yes. After that night, things were never the same. I started to feel different. I would have strange dreams, nightmares of snakes wrapping around me, hissing in my ear. And then, slowly, I started changing." "What do you mean, changing?" Yuzo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I started to feel connected to the snake spirit like it was inside me. At night, I could feel it calling to me, telling me things, showing me things. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night, and my body would start to change. Amaka's eyes widened. You mean, you would turn into a snake? Ngozi nodded, a look of shame on her face. At first, it was just small things. My skin would feel strange, like it was covered in scales, or my eyes would change in the dark. But as I got older, it got worse. Sometimes I would fully transform and I couldn't control it. The snake spirit would take over, and I would wake up in strange places, not knowing how I got there. The pastor watched her carefully, his face filled with sadness. Your father did this to you, Ngozi. He bound you to this curse. Ngozi nodded, her face twisted with pain. Yes, he told me that this was our family's legacy, that we were chosen by the snake spirit to be its servants. He said it was an honor, that I should be grateful. But I was just a child. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know it would take over my life. She paused, looking at Yuzo and Amaka with sorrowful eyes. When my father died, I thought maybe the curse would end. I thought I could be free, but I was wrong. The snake spirit was still with me, still calling to me. It told me I needed to find a way to make it stronger. That's why I came here. I thought if I could complete the ritual, maybe the spirit would let me go. Amaka's face was filled with shock and sorrow. Ngozi, you really thought hurting Chidi would free you? Ngozi nodded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't want to, Auntie. I swear I didn't want to. I tried to fight it, but the spirit was so strong. It kept telling me that if I didn't do it, it would punish me. I was so scared. Yuzo clenched his fists, his face a mix of anger and pity. So all those nights, the bite marks, the scratches on Chidi, that was you? Ngozi nodded, looking down at her hands. Yes, I would transform in my sleep. I couldn't control it. I would wake up and see what I had done, and I felt so guilty. But the spirit kept pushing me, telling me I had no choice. The pastor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You were under the power of a dark force, Ngozi, but you fought it today. You chose to let Chidi go. That took great courage. Ngozi shook her head, fresh tears in her eyes. But I still hurt him. I still caused harm. How can I ever be forgiven for that? Amaka felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, fear, and, surprisingly, a touch of pity. She couldn't imagine the life Ngozi had been forced to live, being bound to such darkness from such a young age. But at the same time, her heart ached for her son, who had suffered because of it. Yuzo looked at Ngozi, his face stern but his voice softer. Ngozi, you made a choice today. You could have gone through with the ritual, but you didn't. That means something. Maybe now you can find a way to free yourself. Ngozi looked up, her face filled with a faint hope. You think I can be free? The pastor nodded. It will take time and it will take strength. But I believe that with faith and support, you can break the curse for good. Ngozi looked at them, her face a mixture of hope and despair. I don't know what I would have done without your kindness. You took me in even though I didn't deserve it. Amaka took a deep breath, steadying herself. Ngozi, we trusted you. And even though you hurt us, I can see now that you were hurting too. But this curse, it can't be part of our family. Yuzo nodded in agreement. We need to protect Chidi. We can't have something like this happen again. Ngozi's face fell, and she nodded, understanding. I understand, Uncle Yuzo, Auntie Amaka. I don't belong here. Not with this curse. I think I should leave. Amaka held Chidi close, her mind racing. After everything that had happened, she felt a wave of fear wash over her, and she realized that the trust they had once had in Ngozi could never truly return. She looked at Yuzo, and he gave a slight nod, as if reading her thoughts. Yes, Ngozi, Yuzo said gently. It's time for you to go and find your path. A new path. The pastor looked at Ngozi kindly. You can come to the prayer house, Ngozi. We will guide you, help you find freedom from the curse. You don't have to be alone. Ngozi looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Pastor. I would like that. Amaka and Yuzo watched as Ngozi rose to her feet, her head bowed. She looked at them one last time, a look of deep sorrow and regret in her eyes. I'm so sorry for everything, she whispered. I never wanted this for any of you. With that, she turned and followed the pastor, leaving Yuzo, Amaka, and Chidi standing in the forest clearing. They watched her go, each of them feeling a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Amaka held Chidi tightly, kissing his forehead, and whispered, "We'll never let anything hurt you again, my love." As they began the walk back to their home, Yuzo spoke softly to Amaka, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "We'll make changes, Amaka. No more nannies, no more letting anyone else take care of our son. We'll find a way to balance work and family." Amaka nodded, a fierce protectiveness growing in her heart. "Yes, Yuzo. We'll make time for him no matter what. No more trusting strangers. No more taking risks." They returned home with Chidi, feeling a newfound strength, a determination to protect their family no matter what. They knew that they had been through something dark, something they would never fully understand, but together, they could face whatever came next. And as they closed the door behind them, they silently vowed to cherish and protect their family, never again letting anything or anyone threaten the safety and peace they held dear.